All right, everybody, if we can gather our attention up here. My name is Ethan Vanderleek. I'm a doctoral student in theology here at Marquette. I've been part of this reading group, which has borne fruit in this symposium, which you are all attending here now. I should say a huge and enormous thank you to Jorge, who has already been thanked, but I want to personally also extend my thanks. The reading group was Jorge's idea, and it was his energy that kept it together. And it is also this symposium, which is a really special way to sort of culminate all the work we've done this semester, is also very much thanks to Jorge. So he's a stellar human person. Huge, huge thanks, Jorge. Yes, round of applause. So it's been very special to be part of this reading group over the course of this year. I heard at the opening theology semester picnic early in the semester, I was like, oh, there's I think that Mary Amney and Cody were saying, oh, there's this interesting reading group about narrative selfhood. And I thought that is just one of my favorite and most topics I'm most interested in. And so luckily enough, I managed to sort of tag along and hop on board. And then the psychology and philosophy interdisciplinarity was expanded to include theology, which I've been privileged to sort of take on a minor leadership role of. And so in our reading group, our theology portion focused, unsurprisingly to many of you, on St. Augustine's Confessions. Is a classic Christian text that is one of the first places you think of when you think of narrative, selfhood, identity, and its relation to theology. So we had some really rich, interesting conversations. And then as we were trying to put together this symposium, I didn't have immediately, there was nobody who I immediately thought, oh, I want that person to come speak. So I did some sort of scoping around in the Lake Michigan area and came across the work of Dr. Colby Dickinson, who's here to share his thoughts with us today. And so I'll tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Dickinson, he's the Associate Professor of Theology at Loyola University in Chicago. He studied at Duke University, St. Louis University, and received his doctorate at KU Leuven. He is a writer and researcher on the relationship of theology and continental philosophy, and is an expert in the thought of Theodore Adorno and Giorgio Agamben. He has published widely in this area, and some of his recent titles include the Theological Poverty in Continental Philosophy After Christian Theology, The Fetish of Theology, The Challenge of the Fetish Object to Modernity, and Theology in Contemporary Continental Philosophy, The Centrality of Negative Dialectics. And what caught my attention in particular when sort of scoping out his work was another recent book, which is entitled Theology as Autobiography, The Centrality of Confession, Relationship, and Prayer to the Life of Faith, which was a book that came out of the course that he taught at Loyola, which looked at a whole host of different autobiographies throughout the Christian tradition, St. Augustine himself featuring as a chapter, but also many more recent writers as well, and throughout Christian history. So we read the opening chapter of this book for our reading group, which was a really fitting complement to our brief study of Augustine's Confessions. And the chapter we read described the incomplete nature of the self, how this incompleteness opens us up in vulnerability to others, and how God in the Christian tradition can in fact be understood as vulnerable, can in fact be understood as exposed. Christian faith, he says in this chapter, is embodied and lived out. It's not merely an abstract assent to propositions, but rather a focus on relationship, vulnerability, creative translation and interpretation of faith into new settings. And we'll hear more on some of these themes from Dr. Dickinson's talk this afternoon. And it's been a huge pleasure, Colby, getting to know you over the past few months. I actually live in the Chicago area myself, and I'm commuting up to Marquette, so we were able to have a beer on the campus of Loyola, and we had lunch together this afternoon, which has been a great pleasure. He's a stellar human person, and I'm really excited to have him share his wisdom and insights with us today in our interdisciplinary exploration. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Colby Dickinson.
thank you very much. I guess there is no podium mission. I can see why you were holding your tongue. I'll do the same. Thank you very much for having me, for inviting me to be here, for organizing such a wonderful event. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity, even more so because I wasn't aware of how the two talks this morning would really converge into what I'm trying to talk about. So I've made some notes that are kind of rambling to myself. I hope I'm coherent in certain parts because I've made some additions based on what I've heard this morning, and I'm hoping to speak a little bit more directly to my interlocutors today, which thank you both for your talks, which I found immensely rewarding. And I hope in some way I can provide even just a small glimpse of insight into this conversation that's trying to address an interdisciplinary nature of our work. So again, thank you for that. I'll say one brief preface, which is that I'm never really sure what the task of theology today is. I often don't really feel like a theologian. I'm really not in some ways. But yet I contemplate this question a lot. What is the task of theology? And I think in some ways I would say the task is to link together things that we didn't think were linked, which is an interdisciplinary effort, to see the fundamental interconnectedness of all things in some way, and then to sort of fade away and let those connections stay. I see it that way because I think theology is ultimately a kenotic exercise. It's a willingness to weaken oneself and to let the connections that are made stand on their own. I think in some ways it's like building bridges, both seen and unseen, and then relinquishing control or some sort of desire to imprint any of the situation. I think we can perform these somewhat sacred or quasi-sacred tasks that then become ordinary, we'd say secular, and just let them be. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that entirely what I'm trying to do here, but it at least informs part of what I'm thinking about as I look at the links. In the history of the field that's often referred to as political theology, there are some truths that consistently appear and reappear and which serve to underscore how theology often historically has legitimated particular political configurations, such as how one reigns sovereign over both themselves and over others, like the divine right to rule of kings, for example, legitimated through some connection to Christ as king. Rather than embrace relational models of interdependency, which generally involve some recognition of plurality and difference, Western theology has more often engaged in blatant attempts to justify an almost wholly autonomous existence and the autonomous existence of its God. God, in fact, is typically defined as wholly beyond the activities of humanity, and humankind, for its part, seeks then to legitimate rulers almost themselves wholly detached from any form of accountability. From Pope Boniface VIII's 14th century papal bull claiming sovereignty over all matters, both spiritual and temporal, to the legitimation of modern-day nation states, autonomy becomes the great force that guarantees one's sovereignty in a political context, though such desires are, of course, nothing new to humanity in multiple contexts. If the United States was subject to the laws of another country, for example, we'd say it would limit our ability to govern ourselves, hence any claim we might make to be sovereign. I think this is why certain political voices in this country, of course, frequently dislike things like the United Nations or a treaty against landmines or the International Criminal Court or even a Supreme Court justice like Stephen Breyer, who occasionally cites other nations' laws in their rulings. Each of these things appears to curb our sovereign power at some point, what is considered our right to self-rule. So it's no surprise to me ever that a nation founded so strongly on its own sense of sovereignty is capable of breeding so many libertarians who demand the right to self-rule and to enforce that right through an accompanying right to bear arms. To be sovereign means to be in control of oneself, one's destiny even. It enables one to assert a form of self-governance that cannot be superseded by another's rule, and so it inadvertently cuts off those relationships that might actually prove helpful in seeing the faults within one's own methods and self-perception. Those models of interdependency that seemingly weaken us at times through a recognition of our responsibility for others. This is one of the reasons, among others, that I'll refer to this type of autonomous self. This is grossly stereotypical, but I'll refer to it as masculine. This is my autobiographical element, right? This is what I'm taught. as even stopping to ask for directions is already a concession, that one does not know what they are doing entirely, but must somehow rely on another to establish their sense of self within a given space and time. And I mean that even psychologically, not just literally when you're lost for directions. Men from a very young age in this stereotypical generalization are taught to be autonomous beings, islands as it were, who are only capable of being lords of their own castles insofar as they can demonstrate their propensity to act unilaterally to accomplish the extreme actions of their will. Men, like the sovereigns that they seek to become, make decisions and take action, we often say, before thinking through the consequences of it, because that's what real men do. I think of George W. Bush saying, the most important trait of a leader is you have to act, even if it's the wrong action, you have to act. They perpetuate and exaggerate the illusions of sovereignty because they are instructed to do so by the communities that shape them. To abstract oneself to the point of denying one's own material embodiment, as men are often wont to do, is precisely what I've elsewhere called the fetish of theology. A blatant attempt to remove oneself from the material conditions of their existence in order to assert a certain sovereign force over those others who do appear to be materially dependent. It's like you're taught to materially abstract yourself in order to assert the sovereign force, as opposed to all those others who really aren't dependent on material conditions of existence. Women's dependency on their bodies is often how it's framed, whereas the man can abstract from his own physical needs. I don't need to see a doctor. I'm not cold in the cold weather, these kinds of things. And this is how often indigenous fetishes in a colonial context are framed too. They are dependent, like animals are dependent on other people to survive. Christian missionaries have once tried to label West African sacred objects as fetishes, while refusing to concede that their own religious material items, sacramental objects, crucifixes, the relics of saints, and so forth, that they were also selected moments of transcendence within an immanent material reality. Civilization, in fact, has often meant little more than the ability to detach oneself from and so obscure the material conditions of one's own existence, involving anything from the reality of economic and labor conditions to the realities of one's own bodily needs. And there's lengthy commentaries on monastic traditions and spiritual disciplines that certainly resonate with what I'm suggesting. I first arrived at this idea of theological fetishes when I was visiting the Colonialist Africa Museum in Tver, Belgium, when I lived there, where looted African holy objects were on display everywhere in a country where no one would dare to put a consecrated Catholic sacrament on display in the museum. To note this difference, one that's deeply part of a specific political theological nexus of relations, wasn't just to observe a contradiction. It was to know where the reins of power lie within this Catholic European nation, and so also to sow the seeds that might potentially undermine its authority through exposing such contradictions. To fail to notice the overlap between the African fetishes and the Catholic sacramental objects is to fail to see the hegemonic relations that have structured Western political theology for centuries. To live in such a state of detachment is to fail to recognize where the possibilities for liberation actually lie. What I saw in Tver is the same detachment from the material conditions of one's existence that most typically places women's bodies on a very different socio-cultural plane of existence than male bodies. Again, stereotypically, bodies are inscribed in some way. Women's bodies are theologically molded to specific coordinates, governed by those theological signatures that are destined to be inscribed upon these bodies as part of nature, whereas men are often able, or at least attempt, to abstract from their bodies and the material conditions of their lives in order to reside in a sphere called mind, or some staged pure rationality, forms of transcendence from the body, and of course imitating a divine God who's also without a body, and his immateriality is the guarantee of his sovereignty, according to Aquinas and so many others. Much of Western culture on the whole has too often hidden behind racist judgments of this sort. We Westerners can objectively observe and label the others primitive or materialistic superstitions while not taking part in such activity ourselves. Somehow we, Westerners, men, have escaped such material limitations through the abstract powers of reason itself. What is perhaps the greatest myth that the modern age still propagates. So breaking down the boundary between the fetish and the sacrament, for example, and so allowing ourselves to critique Bible-wielding fundamentalists as really fetishists at heart, is only one way to widen our criticisms of this thing I'm calling sovereign power, and the mostly Western theologies that have buttressed their imperialistic racist claims in the modern period. Now, the reality, of course, and this goes back to something you said this morning, Mario, the reality is that we all have fetishes, and we hardly even comprehend the existence of all of them. It's like saying we're the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time. We have myriad ways of working through our embodied existence and the material dependencies of having, and the material dependencies that having a body entails. As Roberto Esposito has pointed out, our legal systems make distinctions between persons and things, but have no real way of calculating which category the body belongs to. Is it a person or is it a thing? Fetishes are these material attachments which we construct in order to help us deal with those contexts in our lives where meaning is over-determined. It's one of the ways Robert Orsi puts it, his colleagues at Northwestern. That is where too many symbols and representations clash in ways we can't mentally suture together. Fetishes are a material embodiment of a redoubling of the self, like a totemistic object that is myself put into a material form before me that I look at that then somehow allows me to establish the sense of who I am to myself. It's a physical representation, if you will, an image of myself back to myself. And of course, it takes on a divine aura at the same time. I'll come back to this idea of a redoubling, but a fetish is part of this redoubling, I would say, of the self. Our failure to make sense of our own lived embodied reality literally results in a dependence upon a particularly fascinating scrap of material reality, though it matters little what this material reality is, though money and the exposed parts of the human body often do the trick for most. Our fetishes will always fail to provide a solid foundation for meaning to cohere, and so we return to them again and again in the hopes they will yet provide enough comfort to deal with the absence of a consistent narrative that we can sovereignly control. And I want to say that to me has I would love to put that in dialogue with your talk this morning about the coherence of the narrative, but also wanting to control that coherent narrative. But then in what ways does the narrative escape our control? So we write books about it, we tell our story, we make an autobiography to reflect back to ourselves the narrative we want of ourselves in some way. Something like this. The failure of our fetishes, just like the failure of our representations of reality, teaches us a good deal about who we are, however, should we be mature enough to listen. In fact, accepting the failure of our fetishes to ever fully satisfy us is actually, I would argue, the key toward finding a liberation from their severe emotional hold over us. In other words, St. Paul of the New Testament letters, Paul's distinction between the flesh and the spirit has yet another application for us. Embracing our failure to ever fully be identified with our externally manifested embodied state is precisely what we need to do, though we can't be completely abstracted or spiritualized from our embodied lives altogether. We return to our communities and our communities knowing only that these things do not fully define us, and that we only utilize them in order to be understood by one another in some sense. To think that they could do more for us, that we could fully identify with them without remainder, is precisely the fascist fetish par excellence. It's no wonder that a good many men who are exceedingly willing to over-identify with their claims to power also typically have some dark closeted fetish. I mean that even in a very literal sense, right? I think, personally, I'm never surprised when this occurrence takes place, as it so routinely often does. When the fetishes of our lives fail us, we are forced to confront the actual material conditions of our existence, and so to take a cold, hard look at our lives that we are living for real. When the fetishistic aura of the attractive or sexualized other fades, we see only the vulnerable, naked body before us, shorn of its sexuality or its sexual allure, less than what we take sovereignty to be, but for that reason, more likely to be embraced as a human being with human bodily needs. We know this difference all too well, and it's why a fully naked body, I would submit for illustration, a fully naked body could be shown on primetime television back in the 90s when the movie was Schindler's List, while in the fetish column, Janet Jackson's nipple could set off cultural outrage. We all have fetishes, and we simply can't do away with them. We only can instead point to where our fetishes fail us, and where we are forced to confront the material conditions of our existence, and I would say the precarity of our own bodies in that space of failure. This is why we also can't do away with the desire to be sovereign in some sense either. as it structures our sense of self and our belonging to a particular world and a particular narrative. But what exactly is this political theological legacy of sovereignty in relation to the self that speaks loudly to us today, especially when we contemplate the narrative of the self that we all construct and govern? The concept of sovereignty can be seen prominently on display in the most fundamental of philosophical and theological statements about human and divine existence alike. I'm referring to this act of redoubling that seems to crop up in nearly every major book that deals with such subjects throughout the centuries. And I'm gonna think about it. I want to go into this idea of the concept of redoubling as also part of the redemptive act. I'm speaking specifically to your talk this morning. The idea of an act of returning to oneself. So redoubling is fundamentally a return to oneself. And I think there's certainly a language of redemption that takes place in this return. But I'm also calling the act of redoubling into question in some way. It's the circularity of the act of redoubling that brings us face to face with the contradictions of sovereignty. And yet at the same time, it is how sovereignty is exposed as a fundamental part of human consciousness itself. We are only able to be human, I would claim, insofar as we engage in these acts of redoubling. It's no coincidence that such acts are central to religious narratives and the metaphysical worlds that are bound up with them. Redoublings are therefore, and again, I'm speaking directly to the talks this morning, redoublings are therefore always fictive, they're illusions. Though they are also the conditions for a shared cultural intelligibility in this thing we call self. Take, for example, how Aristotle once defined God as the purest act of thinking about thought. This redoubling of a concept, thinking about thinking itself, which is what Hegel, I would say in some ways analogously, would use to define the absolute as the concept of the concept, is what creates an abstract space apart from the immediacies of our lived reality. We literally open up a space for abstract thought by thinking about the processes of thinking itself. No longer are our thoughts tied to the immediate situation we find ourselves in. You know, we could think, oh, there's an apple tree over there. I'm going to go pick an apple off of it and eat it. But now we're also capable of thinking about those immediate unreflective thoughts themselves. Suddenly, instead of just thinking about picking an apple and eating it, we're thinking about why we want an apple in the first place and what good that apple would do to prevent the doctor from coming around more often. There is in such acts a deliberate reflexive tendency toward abstraction and transcendence, and so too the possibility of being removed from the material conditions of existence. Hence, the desire for power is also always the addictive fetish for power. Hence, the man who ignores his bodily needs in order to assert his strength as a form of dominance over others. Hence, too, as Derrida once pointed out, the tendency of the author to claim to be the first to critically and insightfully make a claim that no one else has made before in order to be sovereign as author. God would be the ultimate example of this redoubling of desire. But so is the oppressed minority of the nation state today, begging for their autonomy and to be freed of their serfdom to more powerful agents. In other words, and despite the negativity that often accrues around explorations of sovereign power today, the self-reflexive act of redoubling is what enables us to make a narrative of our lives a meaningful narrative for ourselves. I can take my story, I can examine it, I can shape it and reshape it, present it to others and to myself at the same time. To suffer an interruption of this narrative, whether self-inflicted through lying or memory loss or self-harm, or to have it interrupted by an external, maybe even violent force, introduces the possibility of compromising one's sovereignty over oneself. To fail to have a self-narrative that is autonomous to some degree can create the conditions for some forms of personal instability. Philosophy begins in the act of redoubled or self-reflexive thought. We're able to define ourselves as human through this capacity to engage in self-reflexive redoubled thinking. As should surprise no one, this is how humans have typically and traditionally placed themselves atop the animal kingdom, sovereign lords over all other unreflective species that litter this small globe. Theology, with its metaphysical construction of the universe, provides a narrative to legitimate human dominance. Though to be truthful, the only thing that separates the human from every other creature is precisely an act of redoubling. The human is the animal that recognizes itself as human. Should it be a further shock to us that there's a long history within Western monotheism or that this deity even uses redoubled phrases to identify himself. God's name is the ultimate redoubled tautology. I am who I am. To be sovereign, as the Western God frequently demonstrates, means nothing more than to declare oneself as sovereign. In essence, I become sovereign because I say that I am sovereign. This is why the Hebrew God finds it imperative to declare himself to be the Lord and to have no other gods before him. The circle must be complete, without interruption, an entire narrative reflected back onto itself. Any person who worships such a God must learn to enter into the circle of uninterrupted divine self-reflexivity, where the human actually becomes translucent so that the divine narrative alone is what is reflected clearly, directly back onto itself. To do this is, at the same time, however, to worship the very foundations of our own humanity, of our consciousness, of our position as the most dominant creature on this planet. It is, as certain secular humanist critics have on occasion rightly suggested, to define religion as the worship of sovereign power itself. Metaphysics has historically been engaged in providing justification for the ultimately unjustifiable position we find ourselves in. There's no way to legitimate the worship of one God over another God, the hegemony of one people over another, or humanity's dominance over every other creature. Just as there's no way to explain why we recall or tell certain stories about ourselves over other stories. This is part of the psychological mechanisms of us. We can choose all kinds of different stories to tell about who we are, but we've chosen certain ones. And there's really no way to legitimate why those ones should be more important than other ones, except that that's the narrative that constitutes the self that we are. It's simply the choice to tell those stories and not other stories. It's really a story then of the advent of consciousness itself in the act of redoubling. In other words, you could say we've learned to worship these things, and even worship ourselves, as they grant us a sense of sovereignty over ourselves, and consequently over others. Take, for example, the circular contradictions inherent in justifying God's existence. This goes back to Aristotle's unmoved mover, which appears to many to be the only sound proof for God's existence. As religious argument in the modern period typically goes, how could something so complex as the human being appear out of nowhere? There must be an intelligent deity who's designed life as we know it, and who's the foundation for all the complex life that follows. This is typically the same metaphysical speculation that posits, at the same time, however, that an extremely complex deity did precisely just that, appeared out of nowhere as the cause of everything else that followed. This circular argument seeking to legitimate itself is precisely the best way to notice the embodied contradictions of redoubling that are also its hallmark gesture. In other words, the insoluble contradiction of redoubling that gives birth to divine existence is the issue that metaphysics tries to resolve, but which is really an attempt to legitimate and ground the existence of consciousness itself. The complexity and origin of consciousness is not understandable, and so we simplify, and moreover project its insoluble redoublings onto an alleged divine being. This was Heidegger, right? Anyways, the being of beings. God becomes the container, so to speak, of what Derrida called the metaphor of metaphor, which lies at the heart of all metaphysical speculation. I'll repeat the argument, the radical argument, that I want to make a bit more solid, or at least clear. Philosophy is what human beings utilize, not only to abstract themselves from the material conditions of lived reality, but also to proclaim themselves as the sovereign selves that they are, that we are. We rely upon this capacity for self-reflection to be who we are and to stand tall and mighty over all other creatures. But this activity also brings us to the specific impasse that we encountered a moment ago regarding the complex God's existence. We utilize the redoubling's characteristic of sovereignty in order to establish a sense of self, while also having to recognize that they are a fiction of sorts, brought into existence through the act of calling and recalling them into existence. We are subject, perhaps even victims, to our own propensity to assert ourselves. We reside in contradiction with ourselves, and this is precisely what gives rise to our sense of ourselves in the first place. One of the philosophers who most directly dealt with this impasse was Kant, who talked about how our natural capacity to reason dictated to us a series of oppositions or antinomies that were impossible to resolve, but which were yet constitutive of our very reason. The world has a beginning and the world has no beginning. Both appear to be true, and neither can be proved or disproved. That's one of them. Another is everything seems to happen spontaneously with no predetermined plan, though it also appears at times as if everything happens according to natural laws that govern our world. It's like the clickbait I'll sometimes click on, like, is falling in love just purely a chemical process you can't control, or do you have a choice about it? We go back to these conundrums over and over. We keep going round in circles with these, and many people do just that. We hone our humanity through these circular acts of redoubling by doing so. Philosophy at the same time is what allows us to escape from the immediacy of unreflective experience and the way it can impose itself upon us in an almost violent fashion. This is why philosophical thought at its core is always a step back from violent actions, in order not just to promote nonviolence and to cease the creation of victims or victimhood, even the victims we become to ourselves, but to at least allow room for critical thought about violent action to emerge. Religion at its best does much the same, I would say, though there are many religious mythologies, to be sure, that would conceal violence rather than reveal it. Western metaphysics, I would also go on to say, has been party to both sides of the equation, at times legitimating violent domination through sovereign impositions, while at other times serving as a laboratory for working out the implications of redoubling for human existence. When does a metaphysical justification for sovereignty become a legitimation for violence, however? And when does it become a critical philosophical revelation and denunciation of a certain violence? The only true correlate to these positive acts of redoubling that strive to guarantee one's sovereignty, whether human or divine, is to institute another type of redoubling, but in a negative sense. The negation of negation, or what some have called the division of division. If the aim of every positive redoubling is to establish a sense of identity out and above every other thing, then the negative act of redoubling is geared more toward taking whatever identity you already have, and which is constructed on existing social, political, cultural, economic, or religious divisions, and dividing it once again. So the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, and I've done a lot of work at his philosophy, he's made the connection between this negative form of redoubling and its religious expression in the letters of Paul. For Paul, every identity is based on a prior social division, like the split between the Jew and the Gentile that defined the ancient Israelite world. What Paul noticed was that some identities believed themselves to be potentially dominant over other identities, Jew over Gentile, male over female, free citizen over slave. And yet every identity, he also found, could be further subdivided so that its hold on a person was somewhat lessened, and their ability to reach out to others, even those deemed less than oneself, could be related to differently. Each Jew, he reasoned, it's a classic logic of Christianity, each Jew, he reasoned, could be a Jew in the flesh or in the spirit. It was possible to be a Jew in name only, but not really one at heart, just as it was possible for someone to be, he thought, a Jew in the spirit, though not one literally through their mother's family tree. If a non-Jew or a Gentile, as they were called, could be a Jew in the spirit, if not in the flesh, then what was to stop non-Jews from joining this Jewish guy named Jesus, who had been killed for saying too many wild theological things? Paul concluded that nothing should stop them, and eventually, after an argument that nearly destroyed the church, of course, Peter and the other followers of Jesus agreed. This is what I'm calling the critical philosophical approach, one that seeks to lessen the violence of an imposed identity brought about through positive acts of redoubling. It's what makes a certain portion of the Judeo-Christian heritage not just a religion, but a philosophy. This goes some way toward explaining, too, why certain atheist philosophers more recently have argued for a return to religion, specifically this particular Pauline waging. Though this will initially sound like an issue of interest only to Christians, this tension between law and grace, or normativity, and any attempt to avoid the cultural linguistic encoding that normativity brings, is actually a deeply philosophical conundrum that humanity still struggles to sort out. What Christianity attempted to do was to resolve the Judaic impasse between its legalistic and prophetic elements by appearing to take a more liberal, open stance toward Jewish Torah. Those pesky debates, I feel like I'm on an episode of Scooby-Doo when I say those pesky debates, but those pesky debates between Jesus and the Pharisees have very much to do with presenting what appeared to many to be a unilateral opposition to everything kosher. If this were the case, then Jesus' position would be one of antinomian flavor. That is, he would be taking a radical stance opposed to all law. For every defender of the Torah who cried out that God wanted his people to follow the rules, here was Jesus. Here was this Jesus character claiming you don't have to follow the laws at all. Jesus appeared as quite the rebel, always poised to disregard the normative order of religious and social well-being. In the modern period, religious Orthodox persons often refer to such antinomian impulses as nihilistic, in that they appear to disregard all custom, tradition, community, or anything that smacks of the normative identity. They would be in agreement with Martin Luther, who had to temper his own early theological claims for freedom from church authority, when he saw his own followers disregarding all law, producing a situation where he had to argue for the law in his own antinomian theses, as they're called. It almost, in a sense, doesn't matter if we're talking about religious zealots playing guitars during a Catholic Mass or hippies upending centuries of sexual morality in the late 60s. It's all potentially an end-of-the-world situation for those wishing to maintain a certain status quo. It should be no surprise that many historians have referred to events as wide-ranging as the Reformation and Woodstock as being both potentially antinomian. A problem arises, however, when we consider the line from the Gospels where Jesus says explicitly that he didn't arrive on the scene in order to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, as in he isn't trying to be antinomian, but rather to bring the law to its intended destination. Couple this with the fact that he appeared very content to break the rules should the circumstances require it, is saying, for example, the Sabbath was made for the humans, not humans for the Sabbath. And you put these together and you're facing a philosophical quandary, the likes of which we're still scratching our heads about. So what exactly does it mean to fulfill a law and not simply to do away with it? Though his actions appear at times to do away with it. In a somewhat surprising way, it would suggest that something as obfuscating as Hegelian dialectics might actually provide a helpful illustration of the problem, and maybe a potential solution of sorts. The common, let's say, misreading of Hegel's dialectics is that you have a position and you have a normative law that comes into contact with its opposite, an antinomian stance perhaps, and these two polarized opposites come into contact with each other like warring factions at a school board meeting, and you end up producing something new, a third position we call a synthesis. The synthesis seems to be the best of all possible things because it comes out of the previous positions but represents their union. And this thesis meets antithesis, produces synthesis. But the problem, of course, is that's not exactly what Hegel was saying, and many of his learned commentators have been arguing about this ever since before his death. As some of his readers today argue, there really is no need to produce a synthetic third term, but only to keep the two poles suspended in opposition to each other in some fashion. The law will always contain within it an impulse to see its own undoing, as Freud had once described the death drive. And every inclination to take something apart and to stand alone without any governing structure will always harbor a desire to bring a certain order to the chaos. The confrontation of a thesis or a law with an antithesis or an antinomian drive does not result in a new form of perfected reality that will have borne no criticism because it is beyond fault. This is, of course, the communist mistake, right? Reading Hegel in this way, looking for utopian existence. We desire solutions to what seem like intractable problems because we want a feeling of resolution. I would add, I wonder about the word redemption. We want the feeling of resolution, redemption. And certainly that, unfortunately and mainly, this redemption or this resolution evades human existence. We want to progress forward, reaching new heights of achievement and success, and we don't want to be told that we can't conquer everything we perceive as an obstacle. Despite this reality, however, and I always feel like bell hooks when I say this, but our colonialist, imperialist, capitalist, racist, sexist, homophobic impulses don't abate altogether. In fact, we tend as a human race to dig ourselves in even further with the illusion that we can somehow achieve once and for all a stunningly beautiful, entirely consistent, eerily harmonious perfection that erases any polarized tensions within us. We abstract in order to transcend, and we do so with these positive redoublings that give rise to metaphysical speculation in the first place. So what word do we use then to describe a state where the law is not surpassed but only fulfilled? A state which causes us to look at the law differently, not to adhere to it maybe so closely, as if no other options existed, as if no critique could be mounted against it. To realize then that the law can be undone quite easily, like our sense of self at times, and yet that we must also maintain it in some sense too, if we are to be the symbolic, language-wielding animals that we are, and so actually to understand one another and have any shared intelligibility. Antinomian doesn't quite work, because it's established in opposition to law as perhaps it needs to be. When a political impasse is reached because an issue of justice has been ignored or repressed, it makes sense that some people take up the radical position of wanting to do away with the unjust tradition or institution or representation. As so many calls, let's say, for example, to defund the police, I think sometimes emerge with in people's minds. One commentator on this situation, however, has coined the term hypernomy to try to capture the essence of what is taking place in the attempt to go beyond law while also remaining rooted in law. I think this term contains the essence of what we might be trying to access, though the fact that we still don't have a proper word that's received anything like a common recognition or usage among most people indicates we're still trying to figure out what Jesus was suggesting as a major philosophical point, capable of reinventing our relationship to law, institutions, communities, traditions, and any other stable marker of our identity within our lives, self-narratives included. The early Christian Paul seemed to have something like this in mind when he spoke of the flesh-spirit distinction, because the secondary division of a more primary division between Jew and non-Jew effectively undid the social and religious representations that people relied heavily upon for their sense of self. In suggesting a secondary division of the primary division, Paul was able to find a way beyond the laws that bind humans while still embodying those very same laws of identity in some sense. Consider, for example, how he claimed to act like a Jew with the Jews and like a Gentile with the Gentiles, which reminds me of Mariana had a quote about being a Mexican with the Mexicans, but feeling like an Indian with the Mexicans. You don't fit, and you know what it's like to cross those borders. Paul's doing this. So he's acting like two different groups, and he's effectively upholding both normative identities while also undercutting the force of both. He stands, as Mariana put it, between two worlds. He's in between. To the religious fundamentalists today, he wouldn't even be a deplorable cafeteria Christian, picking and choosing his beliefs. I think he would be labeled as an apparent relativist, adopting the identities of either as it suited him. But I think, however, this would be far from the truth that he was carefully adopting. To be a Christian was philosophically an act of negating the externally imposed identity so as to adhere to an internal marker of the self that cannot be captured by any normative representation or law. He could therefore adopt any representative identity because he was truly bound by none of those representative identities. This was the freedom he was capable of experiencing, and it was pretty potent stuff to behold, especially during an era when slaves were considered well beneath Roman citizens and women were considered the property of men, but in which he suggested that in Christ there was neither slave nor free person, neither male nor female. Here was a movement that was willing to allow both oppressed groups a seat at the table, with each individual being potentially equal to anyone else. I call Paul's move a philosophical move and not just a religious one, because it's an emancipatory logic that we're still trying to get our heads around. Though Paul may look terrible to some according to today's standards by suggesting that a runaway slave should go back to their master, as he suggests in one of his letters, he was only able to suggest this tactic because he believed that none of us are held to these identities at all, in some way. I imagine that he would say if he were around today, that if we could leave behind the oppressive dualisms that would see one side dominate over another, that we should embrace whatever freedom we could get, because none of these identities have a real hold over us. When Paul makes the provocative pronouncement that in such a freedom there is neither slave nor free, and this division doesn't really exist because we're capable of dying to such an identity, we get the sense that Paul would be for the abolition of slavery and excited to see so many people freed of such a heavy burden. He clearly imagined the Jew-Gentile divide could be further divided by the flesh and spirit, the fundamental gesture that gave birth to Christianity. I'm surprised it took us so long to catch up on the slavery side. And to be frank, he suggests too that the male-female boundary might also fall someday, because this one too can be further subdivided. Someone might appear to be a man in the flesh, but female in spirit, and well, we might have to embrace that reality too, and vice versa. The fact that we're only now just beginning to see what that might look like, culturally, socially, politically, it's pretty exciting. But it's also a sad sign that we failed for far too long to grasp what is really going on with this particular philosophical trajectory. I'm labeling Paul's move as a philosophical one because it resembles exactly what Hegel does when he focuses in the same voluminous pages of the Science of Logic on the dialectic. In this move, he calls the negation of negation. The negation of negation is how we take what is other to us and make it a part of us without, however, doing away with it altogether. It's the way we access universality. Essentially, we grow and we transform because we negate what we once were, allowing us to become something new. So again, maybe something redemptive in this story. But then after some time, we negate that new thing we had become, the original negation. And so what was once opposed to the past, by becoming opposed to even this initial opposition, we're propelled into a series of never-ending spirals away from and towards both sides again and again, hopefully enriching us along the way, as we never really lose anything we once were, only gaining new perspectives and new facets on ourselves time and again. Paul was more than aware of the vulnerability that such identity dynamics bring. He was, in fact, acutely observant of how dividing one's identity makes us vulnerable, internally to ourselves as well as to others, to feel the loss of a strong sense of self, the sovereign sense of self, what the first division tries to guarantee and validate. It means that we're suddenly brought closer than ever to the precarious nature of our own existence and the ways that we sovereignly construct our self-narratives. We often rest firmly in the belief that we are such and such, whatever, when in fact we might just as easily become something quite different, something not so certain or secure, something incredibly vulnerable to the myriad external forces that lay along the edge of our existence. Deliberately entering deeper into one's vulnerability and allowing one's identity to be divided further from within is not something to be avoided, however. It's rather the very means by which we come to value other humans and the rest of our world too. By accessing our most vulnerable space inside of ourselves, one free of every attempt by us or others to label it, and so an attempt to fully control or contain it, we're brought into closer proximity to others who have become acquainted themselves, whether voluntarily or by force, with their own fragile existence. The only way to genuinely stand in solidarity with another, shoulder to shoulder, is to embrace one's own poverty of identity. This and nothing else is what allows us to experience that meeting of two or more vulnerable selves in a state that we sometimes call love. I think Mariana used the word jolt. I like this idea of the jolt that wakes us up. And I was thinking of Jan Patočka, the Czech philosopher. He talks about the solidarity of the shaken. And there's this like shakenness to existence too that alerts us to the solidarity. Perhaps the sovereign self, the redemptive, or as we heard earlier, the redemptive or generative self, perhaps it exhibits a sense of universal solidarity through a permanent encounter with its own weakness and vulnerability. But I think it would have to be a self that knows it could always slide back in between worlds and that no return home is ever fully permanent. Maybe it's the language of exile or pilgrimage again that we have to take up. Sovereignty, like those canonical normative representational forms we shape and adhere to, presents itself as a necessary illusion in the sense that it's entirely fabricated by our own design, subject to innumerable criticisms, and yet it is something that we need so we might ascribe order to our world. In other words, we cannot do without these sovereign gestures, for they are what allow us to use things like language, to have order in our communities, to identify who we are to ourselves and to others. But we will have brilliant and perhaps also terrifying moments when we lose sight of each of these things in our lives, such as when our sense of self becomes rattled or ruined by a traumatic experience. We yet find a way, perhaps, hopefully, to reinvent ourselves and re-identify ourselves once again. We would not be human unless we contain this radical propensity to recreate ourselves over and over. What this radical reinvention of the self points toward is the absolutely hollow nature of our existence. How there really is very little that uniquely characterizes us as human beings in distinction from those other animals that lie all too close to us. We seem simply to be able to recognize that there's an emptiness at our core that allows for such radical reinventions of ourselves. We repeatedly harness then that central emptiness in order to construct new images of ourselves throughout time. What makes us human is precisely the fact we're able to use this internal abyss of meaning in order to produce incredibly creative measures. In many ways, our inability to exhaustively define ourselves is in reality our greatest gift. and that it allows us to produce a limitless number of artistic representations. This is the same thing as stating, as the Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa once did, that it's our artificiality that is most natural to us. It's not just the realms of art or of personal identity that benefit from and are given life by the nothingness that swirls within. The production of ideas themselves, these ephemeral and fleeting thoughts that flit through our brains, takes place each time as a moment of the individual human being confronting the empty space within, perhaps encountered externally as something like boredom, that yet has the power to transform the entirety of our materially embodied conditions. The simple deployment of an idea, as abstract as it is in all of its immaterial glory, is capable of altering political spheres, economic conditions, agricultural developments, urban landscapes, technological progressions, aesthetic enjoyments, and so much more. The capacity to think thoughts, to embrace our inner potential and recreate our actual lived existence based on nothing but a series of thoughts, is thus the defining trait of our species. Because we can abstract ourselves from the immediacy of our lived existence, like our hunger and our exposure to the elements, we're able to carve out a peculiar and unique life for ourselves, unlike anything else this world had ever seen before. Our empty core, which can never be filled, has brought about a history of religious questing to provide the sacred filling to our human donut hole. Such as when Augustine once famously commented that our hearts are restless until they rest in God. But perhaps there's nothing that goes within this hole. Nothing to fill our longing or to be permanently quelling our sorrow. Maybe that is what's divine, the emptiness itself. A dominant political theology is what takes shape when we suggest that something can fill the hole, and we know what it is, and nothing else will work, and we're going to produce what exactly it is. This is what happens when we speculate that something in our nature dictates a particular positive redoubling as itself eternal. That men should dominate over women, for example, or that darker skinned persons are somehow inferior to lighter skinned persons, and so on and so forth. How are we to perceive this ache that is a longing for what will always lie beyond us? What beatific union looks like, if one would stop to ask any mystic worthy of the name, is more akin to what John of the Cross had called the dark night of the soul, wherein most of what we took to be the way we are, or the way the world works, is darkened to the point of nearly being effaced. Coming into close proximity to the hollowness within, we can easily lose sight of our sense of all things sovereign, including ourselves. Humans, in a very interesting way, are actually getting closer to touching their nature when they drift into these negative zones within us, where we encounter only our own uselessness, our lack of productivity, our ability to do nothing, our leisure time and our ability to rest, our non-possessiveness, and our non-violent sides, all of which call to mind the shutting down of the larger machine that we otherwise usually identify with our busy lives and bodies. In a philosophical register, we might say that when we render inoperative the mechanisms that typically generate our human nature, we actually discover there's no nature beneath it at all, and this realization is precisely what makes us human. This all makes a certain logical sense, too, as we are most able to connect with others when we have no set goal, aim, or agenda, when we are literally willing to waste our time with one another. These moments, which mainly take place when we're kids and truly have nothing better to do, are what foster stronger bonds than any scheduled activity intended to build group cohesiveness. This is how I would likewise define prayer, as a total waste of time that's aimed at nothing more but also nothing less than building a relationship with the unknown, the mystery itself, and that which we do not understand. Those contradictions that life forces us to confront but never to resolve. The intellectual life, one might argue, and as a recent writer has argued, is itself a useless endeavor that actually cultivates the inner life and a sense of freedom that has the power in turn to radically alter other lives. We should not be fooled by the lures of social status or even political activism or the superficiality of spectacles literally exploding before our eyes and our cultures. Taking the time to almost literally do nothing is the only thing that will actually bring about change in our personal lives and in our world. This is why any religious person should not shy away from admitting that prayer is a total waste of time and should never seek to be productive or useful. Human beings, because they have this unique capacity to generate ideas and thoughts from within the emptiness within themselves, will always be able to establish a critical inner voice, the conscience, as it has come to be called. that can radically call into question any external phenomenon. The negative inclinations that we possess as innate characteristics of our humanity, our useless, unproductive, empty traits, are what give our existence a decidedly impoverished air. The poverty of being human, which draws us endlessly toward the vulnerable, the suffering, and those who are violently excluded from any group, is also our greatest asset. We resonate with that which we cannot possess precisely because we cannot possess it, and we cannot possess ourselves. And instead of trying to then possess the unpossessable, like the fools that we normally are, perhaps we could learn to see how it's only through our poverty and our inability to possess things, even our own selves, and our stories about ourselves, that we might actually come to enjoy life differently. Take natural landscapes, for example, which are something we cannot possess, but can only observe. Stepping back on the edge of a precipice overlooking a deep canyon, or standing at the summit of a giant mountain, overlooking a vast wilderness, evokes an experience of the sublime because it is something we cannot possess by any means or measure. Everything around us moves to its own music, and there's nothing we can do to bring it under our control. Rather than intimidate us, as so many throughout history have experienced it, and so tried to dominate it, such experiences of nature should be the very thing that draws us that much closer to our own nature, to the unpossessable abyss within us that yet defines us only as the undefinable creatures that we are. Agamben, again, has tried to give a description of what this inner freedom might look like when he depicts what he calls the whatever being, or in other contexts, the form of life. It's a whatever being that defies any category, label, or understanding that might otherwise we would use to try to reduce it. Whatever being is for him something we are all capable of living, a type of existence where we do not fit into a particular order, and we do not become violently reduced to whatever coordinates we usually use in order to classify people, so we might comprehend how they do or do not fit into the given society. The whatever being lives beyond the normative order because it's uniquely attuned to the hollowness at its core, refusing to cover it over in an attempt to flee the anxiety that such a gaping hole within us might otherwise produce. The whatever being is absolutely singular, something that cannot be compared to other beings. In truth, we can only experience intimacy with another once we let go of the standard relations that generally define our bonds with other humans, familial, religious, national. When we let go of such established relations and simply accept the undefined person who stands before us and who acknowledges too the emptiness within themselves as we acknowledge the emptiness within ourselves, we're able to connect through this shared vulnerability and admittance that we are often not who we claim to be. This act of mutual recognition is often profound enough to undo the categories and the labels that society has foisted upon us. So too is it able to see beyond the acts of marginalization and exclusion that mostly define our social and hierarchical worlds. That's all, thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dickinson. I was privy to a draft earlier this week, so I, of course, wrote down like 24 questions. Lots to engage with, lots to appreciate. But I will canonically withdraw myself and allow our community to pose some questions. So go ahead, Gwendolyn.
So, thank you for the talk. I was actually really interested in a lot of questions, because one of the pieces, like a little bit of this, when it comes back to the human, it's really relevant here. And so we have the short story of a little larger than the entire universe. So he talks about where Jesus has left heaven, where Jesus comes from Rome to be with this human again. And so I wonder then, as we're talking about hollowness, if there's also this value system, we can talk about hollowness for the Western religion. And that's not actually a hollowness, but just us trying to, struggle with this lack of control or possession of ourselves. We imagine this not as a domination or possession of ourselves, but rather just engaging fully in being in a way that we are not completely in control, which also lends itself to this gift that there is, this other divine thing that guides us. And so I wonder that, is this really a hollowness? Is this something that's empty? Or is this just us finally admitting that we don't have to be in control of ourselves in that way? And in a way that also lends itself to dominate others, which is part of the sovereignty, the ability to dominate others and ourselves.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, what a great distinction. Like, is it really a hollowness, or is it just simply renouncing that we can control whatever it is? Which I wonder, would that open the door to suggesting that whatever it is could change over time, be different, be given by something else? I would like that reading, but it may not necessarily be that. I don't know. It's a great question. I'm not going to give a pronouncement on that. I think it probably could be either way in a sense. I was thinking of like, Pessoa has these great lines in the book of Disquiet where he talks about how he's an ornament. He's like, I'm just an ornament. That's all I am. Like, I'm purely an aesthetic representation of the self. There's nothing else behind it. I want to be a pure, it's just like I want to be the pure additional, the pure like window dressing. I want to be the ornament and nothing more. And I think of that as like a hollowness in a sense. It's a pure external representation. And what is that spirit on the inside? It's only the thing that allows me to shift in between various things. Like, I didn't get fully into it here, but part of how I understand the Pauline logic of the division of the flesh and the spirit. So we know what the flesh is. It's always very material, like literally a flesh, or it's your identity as a Jew or Gentile or whatever your identity is, male, female. But what is the quality of that spirit? Like, what exactly is that? Is it soul, or what exactly is the content of that soul? And it seems like there's never any content to the spirit. It's precisely what allows him a sense of this universality. He's able to transgress the borders on the first social boundary level because he recognizes the spirit always undercuts whatever that is. But what is that spirit? Well, who knows? And maybe it's a content of something else, we just don't control it, or maybe it truly is simply our access to universality, so it's an empty signifier that way. Something along those lines, I guess. But yeah, I love your question. It's great. I don't have to think about like, what would it mean to just renounce the control? Let whatever is there be there. And then to also say whatever is there, I have to maybe learn to respect its nature, if there's this nature to it, whatever that is. Yeah. It's a beautiful way to think of it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, right.
I was wondering if resistance is still possible while giving up sovereignty as I normally feel. And if so, how would that look like? And if not, then are we also picking up resistance as normative in groups of people that are
well, first of all, no, I'm not advocating for like giving up the idea of resistance. I think part of what I'm arguing is there's a fundamental resistance that's always there. It's always following every normative depiction. Within every normative depiction, there is inherently an active sort of resistance built into it that will always appear. And I think it's when you get these beautiful moments of, I don't know what to call them, like where people interculturally or interreligiously or whatever, they transgress the boundaries when they recognize forms of resistance within a certain normative order overlap with how they see their own force in a totally different culture. Like, so there are people who talk about how do you deal with like intercultural differences or clashes of values. And then one of the strategies is often try to find a minority position within the normative order you oppose, and you can usually identify with that normative, or sorry, with the minority position within a given normative order. That resistance is somehow inbuilt into the system. Like I teach classes like a lot in the history of Christianity, and they'll talk about how every time you institute a normative social sense of what church should be, there's always the heretic. I taught a class on heresy this semester. Like, the heretic is everywhere. And even Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we were talking about earlier, like, his transcendentalism was the radical movement to Unitarianism, which is almost a joke that Unitarians would have heretics, right? But like, he was going beyond every institutional normative order, and that's what came out of Unitarianism. And then, okay, but Unitarianism has buildings, it has churches, and therefore it has survived, whereas Transcendentalism had no organizational abilities, so it's not there. I mean, the resistance is always possible, but unless the resistance can form its own sense of sovereignty in itself, it will never be able to pass itself along. I think this is why we get frustrated with political revolutionaries, or even like Obama. People are like, he's going to change everything, and then he becomes president. It's like, well, not everything. Maybe he's more part of the system than we thought. He was less transparent with some documents than George W. Bush was, right? People who keep track of transparency and talk about this. But that's also the nature of sovereignty. Like, once you embody that representative moment as that figure, you have to live in a certain way of being a certain moment. And so the resistance will seem muted, but it never goes away. And it's something it's a game along those lines, and that's how I'm reading this again in dialectic, not as you're going to achieve for real a sovereign form that never oppresses anyone. No, and you're never going to fully have a minority group who, once they get into power, is totally just. No, it doesn't happen either. And this is why, like, I wrote an article a long time ago on the French novelist Jean Genet, and Genet, says, I will champion the Black Panthers and the Palestinians. I'll fight for the oppressed person, the minority, until they become the one in power, and then I leave them. And people were thrown off by that. Like, how can you say you're going to champion the Palestinians until they get a country of their own, and then you're done supporting them? He's like, because that's the moment they'll be corrupted. And I think it's something like, it's that dynamic that's always present.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I found your talk really interesting. Part of the Hegelian theme that you're getting at with like mutual recognition, the ability to abstract from immediacy and this capacity for redoubling, Hegel would say that it's a historical achievement, right? So that our ability to do these things, especially mutual recognition, is because of the historical achievement of modernity and the way that our states are set up. So that's going to be Hegel's fundamental view. I think this matters because at the beginning of your talk, you're talking about generalizing masculine and feminine identity, women's bodies versus men's bodies, and you cast doubt upon the generalization that you're doing. I think if you're concerned with power dynamics and liberation, the abstraction from this doubt, whatever you're doubting about it, I think you need to dive deeper into that, because what it seems to me is that this capacity to be able to distinguish between women's and men's bodies fundamentally rests upon the social historical achievement of erasing intersex bodies. So the reason that we can have this binarization of male, female, bodies of certain types is the erasure, the genital reassignment, the coercion of intersex bodies. I think that's something that could be highlighted at the beginning of the talk about these issues, especially because later you get into St. Paul and the idea that there is no female, there is no man. I would also just add that the idea that you quickly mentioned, this is a recent development where somebody could be man in the flesh, but female in the spirit. I'd really push back on what do you mean by this? Is it that somebody who is, quote, female in spirit, fundamentally their body or their flesh is always going to be something that they are not? Are we making a claim about whether or not people who identify as women truly have woman bodies? Yeah, so again, because of the Hegelian themes of our ability to abstract being based off of social achievements, these are concerns I have for the talk, because these are the type of power dynamics that make these thoughts possible. And it goes to who's capable of redoubling, who's capable of the redemption, because redoubling is the condition for intelligibility, like you say. So it seems like the condition for intelligibility for intersex people is coerced sex effort.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. The categories I was bringing up, and this is the limitation of the categories themselves. I was using ones that I would say are familiar, but I was using them because they're Pauline ones. Not that I subscribe to or think those dualisms are somehow ones we should stick to, or those are the essentialist ones. I don't want to reduce it to an essentialism anyway. And so in that sense, I was using it merely as, like I said, a stereotype in a sense. How someone may say, this is what I feel, this is what it is. Not that I would even think those are helpful or need to be helpful. So in that sense, I agree completely with what you said. All the dualisms themselves, whatever they are, need to be rigidly interrogated. Should that dualism even be what structures our identifications? That's part of the task that's before us, I think. And it's a wonderful task. So no, I'm not clinging to any claims like I have some vested interest in maintaining the dualism itself. No, I was using it merely as the way Paul uses it when he describes the Jew-Gentile distinction. And I was using his categories and saying the person may feel like a female but be a male externally in a Pauline, very simplistic sense, the way he described a Jew externally but feels like a Gentile, a Gentile externally but feels like a Jew on the inside, whatever that even means. I don't even know what that means. I mean, to be very clear about it, when Paul says it's a Jew or Gentile, internally or externally, what does that even mean? I'm not even clear on that distinction. But that's a very Pauline distinction, right? He uses that as the foundation to begin this Christian thing. Now, again, like the slave-free distinction, we could unpack that in many ways and say that dichotomy itself, completely a wrong, dualistic way of thinking, to divide humans up into those two categories. But that's Paul's distinction. He uses that language when he deals with the runaway slave Onesimus, right? In his letter to Philemon, like, he looks like a slave on the outside, but he's actually free on the inside. And I would simply say, what a terrible way to distinguish human beings. Like, I mean, what does he look like a slave? What does that mean, right? Like, that whole thing needs to be deconstructed as well. So I say that because then you're talking about the male-female, founded on an exclusion of intersex persons. Yes, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with one bit. That dualism of the male-female itself needs to be deconstructed, but it's one that Paul was using, so I referenced it in that way. I'm not looking to make it more than that, because that's not an area I'm going into.
Yeah, no, I wasn't taking you to defend those claims.
No.
I was saying that there was an opportunity here to bring this up.
Oh, great opportunity that needs to be brought up. Yeah, because when you're reductive and you fail to take account of the complexity of life beyond the dualisms, it's as you said, you're reinforcing a hegemony of some kind. Someone's being excluded here.
Yes.
On purpose. I heard a wonderful paper years ago from a Catholic theologian who was self-identified as conservative, and then said that now they were rethinking their whole world, because every time they talk about Catholic social teachings, they would say, well, the Catholic Church teaches about complementarity between male and female, but every time they would do it, all they could think about was the student who sat in the front, smiling and looking so happy at them, who would come up to the teacher before class and said, I love your class, this is so great, but I want you to know I'm intersex. I'm really curious to see what you have to say to me that applies to me and my Catholic faith. And the teacher was like torn in half, because they were like, they said every time they would talk, they would say, male or female, and in their head they would say, but this doesn't apply to you.
Yeah.
To this one person in the front. And she was just devastated by this experience. And it was causing her to question everything in her theological worldview because of that experience. You're precisely right. The whole Catholic complementarity system, for example, is built on an exclusion of certain persons who do not fit into that mold. Yeah. It's a wonderful comment. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Thank you, Dr. Dickinson, and for very stimulating talk with much in there. I would join the press as well on this, on your reading of Paul in Galatians 3 in this regard. But it's from a different perspective, for a different reason. That on the one hand, I find it very insightful, just in terms of seeing this as a way of critiquing and kind of negating, as you say, our own tendency towards self-realization in problematic ways, and we don't like that's kind of purely immanent and kinesthetic from our interior. But then I was thinking, and yet, I wonder, it seems to me it doesn't go far enough with Paul's theology, in that he then goes on to say, and yet that all these persons, as that are typically dichotomized in these ways, he defines them and remarries them as one in Christ. And it seems like, from the perspective of Paul's theology, especially as he's find in other places in his letters and so forth, there's this other narrative that comes from the outside that re-narrates, each member, of these different categories that kind of has a tendency towards self-narratization. And so Paul says, but there is kind of a normative narrative that we need to all still, identify ourselves in, and that is Christ. And it entails a certain way of living one's life in certain ways, as he says elsewhere, dying to ourselves, but for the purpose of rising again to new life in Christ, and what that means. And even in the Galatians passage, right after the passage reference, he defines this through kind of this narrative, this Christian narrative of God sending his Son under the law, born of a woman, and then to redefine us as sons of God in a particular way. So I guess I'm just wondering then, to me this seems like this critique of kind of imminent self-narratization, tendency towards redoubling, it might, if we stop there, we miss another key move in Christian theology, that there is yet still some narrative that comes from outside that challenges our own self-narrative, but precisely from the perspective of transcendence, the Logos made flesh, which is Christian revelation ultimately, and forcing us to kind of be regenerated from the outside, challenge to our inner. So yeah, I'm wondering if you want to comment on that, how you see that fitting in your project.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you're illuminating the only possible way for church to stay church, right? I mean, you're bringing in like the only way for the religion to exist as an institutionalized normative religion is to read that oneness in Christ as the return of some sort of normative identity. This would be like the content on the inside, but there has to be a content of it to that spirit, and that content is not just our access to some sort of generalized empty universality, but it's in fact revelation, as you put it, or it's the oneness in Christ, as you put it, whatever this is. And it has to be interpreted, at least in some measure, as a normative order of some kind. And I think it's where you get the Christian religion. It's where it comes from. I don't think at the same time, though, that it was always clear, even to people who were part of that movement, that that's what was happening. I think of the example of like, at first they didn't call themselves Christians. There wasn't a way they understood their identity. For so many years, they were just followers of the way behavior. Like, they didn't really see themselves as different than the Jewish tradition for a while. I think there was an ambiguity to it, maybe more so than even the church likes to recognize. And then I'll go back to like when I taught this course this semester on heresy, like we're always in that space of like, is this a new religion we can give a content to with its own revelation? And we say this is what it is. And then with the new movements that are heretical or that appear to be challenging the normative identity of the religion just will keep creeping up over time. Because of course in the history of heresy, every time you think you have a fixed sense of what church is, boom, up pops a movement to say, nope, that's not it. And that instability that's fundamentally part of the Christian story, I think is made possible because precisely we're not able to make a clean, permanent coherence to this tension between every identity being undone and a oneness in Christ. It's like saying the church versus kingdom of God. Like there's always this movement between them that never fully becomes fixed. I'm arguing that, and I just alluded to it, but I'm arguing that that dynamic isn't just a Christian dynamic. I mean, that's in Judaism, the tension between the legalistic side, let's say, like your Ezra's and Nehemiah's, versus the prophetic side. One says you must follow the rules, take the foreign wives and drag them by their hair out of the community. And the other side says, I care nothing for your rules. I want true justice to flow like a river. That tension never seems to cohere, right? It's always stuck. You can't bring them together. And I feel like what I'm certainly talking about in my talk today, the way I'm looking at it from a very philosophical, I call it multiple times as the philosophical move I'm trying to describe. I think I'm definitely talking more about this as a tension that seems embedded within both Judaism and Christianity. It seems to be a larger dynamic, a philosophical dynamic about the nature of universality and moving beyond identities in that sense. But to be expressly theological about it, yes, we'd have to plug in some return of the normative sense of identity. And as you said, revelation would have to probably accompany that. My issue becomes then that that's what every religion does, so to speak, right? So what makes it unique? Like what's unique about this opportunity, this way of seeing it? And I think it's more of a philosophical view that appears unique to me at this point. But it's not to discount what you're saying. Again, I think you're talking about the very survival of the religious tradition. That's the way it has to understand itself.
Yeah, I would just add to that from Paul's perspective, at least in 1 Corinthians 15, he seems to think that part of what makes it unique is what he sees to be the historical fact of the resurrection of Christ, and that there's something that has confronted him, and it's the risen Christ, and that it challenges any preconceived narrative that he has with what he's been confronted from outside. Yeah, and at least as he says, it's sort of close to the letters that Christian 15.
Yeah, maybe we're going to start proof texting because I feel like, but then 1 Corinthians 1, right? It's not miracles, it's not wisdom. We're looking for Christ crucified, which places the stress more on this poverty and this weakness that I'm referring to in that sense. Resurrection to me is always that moment of like the reimposition of a certain normativity, right? As opposed to the crucified side, which is the poverty of the identity itself and the death of what we thought sacrality was.
But I mean, I think for Paul, you can't have one without the other. It's something.
It's 3:30, it's time for a break. How long is our break, like 10 minutes? Is it?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, so in 10 minutes, we'll gather back here. Let's thank Dr. Dickinson one more time.